I would like to share with you today some thoughts about Jerusalem, or rather use Jerusalem as a metaphor to illustrate the tension between the archetypal dimension of the collective psyche and living reality. Basically, that which has great significance on an archetypal level when it is identified with, and I mean identified with, not just nourished by, but truly identified with, it has a tendency to turn into its own shadow, sometimes to the extent that it becomes evil. I hope to explicate and make that comprehensible during my little talk today. Unlike Rome, not all roads lead to Jerusalem, and those that do may all too easily lead the visitor astray in a labyrinth of divinity and madness. In the course of history, when Rome became the center of power, sanctity, and glory, Jerusalem sank into spiritual ruin and peripheral oblivion. Thus, even those modern roads that bring you smoothly to the city may force the pilgrim to pass, as legend has it, through thorny hedges, mainly perhaps of his or her mind. One may conveniently approach Jerusalem from the west, ascending the modern highway which climbs eastward through the Judean hills like a Western mind moving towards the Orient. It is, in fact, by facing the Orient, the east, where the sun rises, that we find our way. That is, the way we find our way to orient ourselves. By approaching Jerusalem, driving on the comfortable asphalt that smoothly covers the ground and softens the bumps, one may arrive only to find a noisy and neglected city, seemingly tired by too much spirit and worn out by too much poverty. Slowly winding up upwards through the hills, parallel to the highway, runs the dusty old donkey path burdened by archetypal history. Arriving this way, one may find the sparks of illumination that shine from within the dry stones, as well as the strife and conflict that cut through the hard rocks of Jerusalem. Alternatively, one may proceed toward Jerusalem on the route of the patriarchs from the desert in the east. This is, in fact, the path on which the ancient Hebrews arrived as they crossed the river into the land of Canaan, thus gaining their name and reputation as Hebrews, Ivriim, which means those that came from across the river. That is the original name of the Hebrews. One may capture Jerusalem by drawing the sword against evil spells, as did King David from the Jebusites 3 millennia ago, or enter the city humbly on a donkey like Jesus did, and like any future Messiah is supposed to do as well, or like the Caliph Omar, majestically riding on a white camel. However, we should maybe keep in mind that the Golden Gate, the so-called Gate of Eternal Life, through which the Messiah of whatever denomination is supposed to pass, has been sealed for 12 centuries. And I hope it will remain so till the end of times. Or, in the words of Franz Kafka, the Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. In whatever way one arrives, the visitor must be ready to overcome the obstacles of earthly Jerusalem, terrestrial Jerusalem, which far from always mirrors her heavenly sister's image of completeness and redemption. As the poet says, crouched among its hills, Jerusalem is immersed with mythological, religious, and symbolic significance. Yet, Jerusalem is scarce in natural resources, and the surrounding land is cultivated rather than fertile by nature. And the so-called Jerusalem stone, that pale limestone that characterizes many of the city's houses, it nearly cracks and shatters by carrying the burden of heavenly Jerusalem, an all too heavy burden. In its often shabby garb, terrestrial Jerusalem seems to want to shake off its celestial glory, releasing itself from the task of being what's called the gateway to heaven. At other times, when the light from above is reflected in her harsh stones, Jerusalem seems to embrace the presence of the Shekhinah, the earthly dwelling of the divine. Especially at dawn and at dusk, the reflection of light may bring that which is below and that which is above, earth and heaven, reality and imagination, into play with each other. It's like marble-like clouds weighing heavily above and stones that seem to radiate light. It is at night time that some hear the voices of the saints and the prophets, often near the western or so-called Wailing Wall, in the nocturnal light of the moon, reflected in the stones of the wall, where centuries of tears squeeze together in the cracks. You find a King David here and a Messiah there, Jesus or the Virgin Mary, in a lunar spectacle of, as if seemingly reincarnated biblical figures. Time has been set aside, and the personal merges with the archetypal, the internal with the external. That's what's called the Jerusalem syndrome, whereby, as Jung writes, something interior can seem to be exterior, and something exterior appears to be interior. Jerusalem wavers between the spirit that takes her to be God's joyous garden, the fountain of the awakening love and beauty of the Shulamit in the Song of Songs, the bride of wise King Solomon, the builder of the temple, and on the other hand, Jerusalem's God-forsaken body, poor and neglected, a shameful and condemned whore, as she is described in Ezekiel. According to legend, Jerusalem has 70 names, or perhaps even more. In the Bible, she is called City of Joy, Praise, Justice, and Righteousness. She's called Beautiful, Comely, and Beloved. As the object of divine desire and dwelling, she is given such names as Hefziba, that is, I delight in her, and Ohaliba, my tent is in her, as if God speaks. Jerusalem is the light of the world, but infamous and filled with confusion, she is also called burdensome stone, oppressing city, a cup of poison, and city of bloodshed. Jerusalem is the holy city, in Hebrew, Ir HaKodesh, which today is the name most commonly used in Arabic, Al-Quds. Poets have wandered the streets of Jerusalem. They have sung her praise and given her names. They have felt both the beating of her heart and the bleeding of her soul, and her inhabitants, Jews, Christian, and Muslim, have rejoiced and have suffered. Drunk on her spirit, the poet's soul has been filled both with blissful light and as well as the dark pain of Jerusalem. Yehuda Amichai, the Jerusalem poet, says Jerusalem stone is the only stone that can feel pain. It has a network of nerves. And we might perhaps quote how the mother of Amos Oz noticed and told him that in Hebrew, the word chefetz, which means a thing, is also the same word as desire. Things have desires. Stones obviously have nerves. So the poets have called Jerusalem names such as early evening purple, in Hebrew Argaman Harbaim, and they've called her awesome beauty, a wall of dreams and a well of salvation, the sealed book and a bird of stone, holy fire, city and mother, for which we have the word metropolis, den of jackals and cup of runes. The meaning of the name Jerusalem has variously been interpreted in various ways. Most commonly, it has been understood as Ir Shalem, the city of Shalem, city of peace and wholeness, or as a combination of the Hebrew words Yerusha and Shalem, meaning legacy or heritage of peace. Often it is considered as a combination of the name that Abraham gave the place after the near sacrifice or binding, the Ikkada of Isaac, together with Shalem, which can also be understood as complete awe of God. The Septuagint and the Vulgate transliterate the name as Yerushalem, thus combining Heros, the holy, with Shalem. The plenitude of names, such as Gateway to Heaven, reflects the extent to which Jerusalem is pregnant with archetypal imagery and projections of wholeness and proximity to divinity, often intense contrast to the torment and conflicts it has suffered through history. Thus, some visitors to the city turn away in dismay at her neglected garb, while others become possessed by archetypal luminosity, sucked in by the myth and religion-soaked ground that they tread. Originally, Jerusalem was the city of Shalem, Ir Shalem, after its mythological founder, Shalem, who was the Canaanite god of creation, of completeness, and the god of the setting sun. Jerusalem is the city of the exiled Jews' eternal longing, as profoundly expressed in the verses of the Psalms. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. And for Muslims, Jerusalem is Al-Quds, the holy. And for Christians, beyond its Old Testament significance, Jerusalem is the passion, crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the grand transition of Yeshua, Jesus from Nazareth, to Christ, the anointed, the Messiah. However, while peace and wholeness have become the insignia of heavenly Jerusalem, the darker side of Jerusalem is already there in its archetypal origin, because in Canaanite mythology, the twin brother of Shalem was Shachar, the morning star. Shachar, which we know from the Jewish morning prayers, Shacharit, or in his Christian denomination, Lucifer, announces the arrival of light and consciousness. He brings the light that emerges from the shades of the dark, the light of consciousness that attempts to overthrow the rule of the gods, but due to hubris falls from heaven. As it says in Isaiah, how are you fallen from heaven, O Shachar, son of the morning? How are you cut down to the ground? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. Shachar tried to go too far, too high up. Shachar and Shalem were the sons of the holy marriage, the Heros Gamos, between the sun god El and Asherah, goddess of the grove and of the sacred tree. In the Bible, Asherah is treated with fear and disrespect. She must not be worshipped, but is to be cut down or burned, to be buried in the repressed shadow of the one God. In fact, it recurs with some frequency in the Bible how the newly emerging Old Testament God fights with the gods that has preceded him, and one of the major ones is Asherah, the goddess of the grove, who has to be cut down. They, Shachar and Shalem, were born out of the goddess's bottomless cavity, and it says, in the kiss and the embrace, Asherah bore Shachar and Shalem, the dawn and the evening. So while every evening Shalem announces the completion of the day and the death of the sun, Shachar pronounces the sun's rebirth in the morning. Paradoxically, yet significantly, the bringer of light, Satan, Lucifer, or Shachar, is the archetypal adversary. The bringer of light, in fact, and quite surprisingly, is entirely shadow. And it is the shadow adversary, that other who stands in my way, that brings consciousness. The shadow is in fact entirely present in the streets of Jerusalem. When Herman Melville visited Jerusalem in 1857, his harsh impression was stones to the right and stones to the left, stony tombs, stony hills, and stony hearts. He noticed dryly that there was too little to see and too much dust. The shadow aspects of the psychological myths pertaining to Jerusalem are evident in actual physical real locations in this city, so full of places where religious events with great psychological implications have taken place. The tiers at the Western Wall reflect the close proximity of shadow with self. How close are not pain, agony, loss and destruction to wholeness, and descent is so close to the fall from heaven. Along Via Dolorosa, the road of agony, the elongated shadow stretches out as a gateway to the self. And just outside the old city of Jerusalem, you find Gai bin Hinnom, the valley of hell, which was once the site of a fire altar called Tophet, Inferno. Children were burned here as a sacrifice to the Ammonite god Melech, or Moloch, the king god, as mentioned in 2 Kings. And he defiled the Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire to Molech. Eventually the shrine was abandoned and became a dumping ground for criminals and outcasts whose corpses were burned in the constantly burning fire, creating the smells and fires truly of hell. It was here, in the valley of hell, that the prophet Jeremiah stood before a crowd of priests and citizens, denouncing their pagan practices. He smashed an earthenware pot and cried out, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, so will I break this people and this city as one breaks a potter's vessel, so it can never be mended again." And in the potter's field, at the southern part of the valley, lies Akeldama, the field of blood, where Judas supposedly either hanged himself or died when he fell and his intestines burst forth. In fact, Jerusalem needs its shadows. It needs its neglected garb. When it is taken too seriously, it turns into fundamentalist or archetypal identification. Let me add a word on archetypal identification. Archetypes, those inhabitants of the collective unconscious, are so important. It's so important for us to be somehow in touch with that archetypal layer so that we can be nourished from the depths of our soul, from the self and from that entire layer of archetypal images. If we are disconnected from the archetypal layer, if we think that we really stand here completely alone, that I am merely my ego, I am merely what I am aware and conscious of, I tend to dry out. It is as if I lose the connection with the greater depths, with the wells that bring up the water from within Mother Earth and from the great mother of our unconscious. But when I identify with whatever archetype, when I identify and believe that myself to be one with whatever grand idea, absolute truth, with whatever God, when I identify with that sense of archetypal totality, I lay the seeds of evil, because then I lose the awareness that every archetype in fact is bipolar. It has a good side and a bad side. The archetype of the mother, of the great mother, has both the fairy, the great good mother, and the terrible mother. Every archetype is bipolar, which in the world of living reality becomes a complexity. But when I identify with an archetype, I become one-sided. So my God is then the only God, and every other God needs to be destroyed. So in archetypal identification, I split off my own shadow and project it onto the other who then must carry the shadow for me, the other who then becomes ever so threatening, becomes someone that I need to eternally fight against and to destroy him, without being aware that if I destroyed the other as the one who carries my shadow, I in fact destroy myself. When Jerusalem is merely the symbol of wholeness and divine holiness, then the stones of the temple and the dome of the rock turn into rivers of blood. It's on the Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah, that the remarkable, awe-inspiring drama of the sacrifice of Isaac took place. The Hebrew term is Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, not the sacrifice of Isaac, but the binding of Isaac. That indicates the dramatic cultural transition from actual deed to internalized faith, from the worship of stone-hard gods to ideational images. In place of Isaac, the ram was sacrificed to God, and Isaac was given to life. The sacrifice need not be literal. The binding of Isaac signifies the striking cultural transition from literalness to symbolic representation. God told Abraham that there is no need for a complete sacrifice, for a literal sacrifice of his son. He will suffice with sacrifice by proxy. Rather than being trapped in the harsh reality of actual deed, reality can be transformed into images, into transformative images. Rather than slaying the flesh of the son, the soul can expand by the creation of images that represent reality, representative images. By substituting the sacrificial animal for the actual son, the story of the Ikkada, the binding, represents the separation of meaning from act, which is essential to culture and civilization. War, on the other hand, is the destruction of representation and civilization. The tragedies on the battlefield are all too real, all too irreversible, and the essence of trauma, of battle and war and Holocaust is the loss of the representative symbol. All that remains is the hellish repetition of trauma. Look at post-traumatic dreaming. Post-traumatic dreams are repetitious. They repeat the actual situation. There is no added symbolism. They become a compulsive repetition of the traumatogenic event itself. It is as if the dream or dreaming as a sewage system becomes clogged, becomes blocked. Because what happens is that since, as you will of course know, that most dreams, we don't remember them. We remember only very few dreams, and those dreams that we do remember, we should take good care of remembering them and bring them into consciousness and relate to them and reflect upon them. But most dreams just disappear into the ocean of our unconscious. So the post-traumatic dream, having lost the element of symbolization, dries up. It is as if the liquid of symbols flows down, dissipates, goes down the drain. And what remains in the sink is the harsh matter of the trauma. And so it bounces back and keeps bouncing back because it just cannot go down the drain until we manage to induce it with some sense of meaning, relatedness, symbolization, images, comprehension, and understanding. In fact, nothing represents the loss of symbolization better than the survivor from hell who holds on to a dry slice of bread, as we know from many Holocaust survivors. In hell, there are no mirrors and no images in the mirror, only the bare walls of suffocation. In the cruel reality of war, the knife is raised and the angels circle above, repeatedly descending, attempting to divert the hand that holds the knife from descending upon the son, until the angels have all gone and the son is no longer bound but truly sacrificed. The knife ripping out the soul of life, and we might say Isaac laughs no more. In the horrors of war, Isaac, whose name means he laughed, laughs no more. And neither does Ishmael, whose name means God heard, because God heard the boy who cried of thirst in the desert, where he had been expelled by his father Abraham. While the conflict between Judaism and Christianity is between the Father and the Son, the Father as the stagnated establishment that governs the temple, and the Son who overturns the tables and casts out the money changers and the pigeon sellers, the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs is a conflict between hostile brothers. Some Muslims, identifying as the sons of Ishmael, claim that it was not Isaac, but Ishmael that was nearly sacrificed. Not every aspect of the ongoing conflict between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, has its roots in this or that ancient myth or archetypal conflict. We should avoid oversimplifications and maybe too much psychologizing, because the conflict can be looked at from many other perspectives: religious, geopolitical, economic, etc. But the mythological roots should not be overseen either. The sense of dispossession, which forms the cultural consciousness of the Palestinians, has its basis in what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe when they and the invading Arab armies lost and the Palestinian refugee problem was created in 1948. It is as well a manifestation, or constitutes a sense of repetition, of how Ishmael was expelled into the desert. Likewise, the threat of extinction, of annihilation, oft repeated through history, is at the core of Israel and the Israelites. You cannot trust that there will always be an angel to prevent the archetypal father from killing you, the sons and daughters of Isaac. There is always a raised hand, as if, even in the holiest of places, threatening to kill you, to take away your blessing. Actual physical reality is, in that sense, for the Jews, never really secure. And for the Jew as a cultural and collective being, it may often be safer to turn physical reality into symbolic abstraction and float in the air like a figure in a Chagall painting over the destroyed village. There is a constant threat that you will be sacrificed by the shadows of reality. But war is not evil. Heraclitus says, war is father of all things. On a psychological and particularly on an archetypal level, Mars is an important energy, no less significant than Eros, even though quite naturally we tend to side with Eros. Mars makes us move, just like aggression, which comes from Latin ad gradere, which means I move, and it is what Winnicott calls the life force. Without it, we don't survive. It is necessary for independence. It is necessary in order for the ego to separate out from the unconscious. But implemented in the realm of living reality, war and constant war does not end well. And I don't mean only actual wars between cultures and nations, but someone, an individual who only thrives on aggression, will not only be independent, he, because it's mostly he, will be so independent that no one will remain there for him. Evil materializes when we strive for and try to implement perfection and totality, whereby the shadow is split off and projected onto the other, whether that other is Jew, Christian, or Arab, Occidental or Oriental. Evil resides in all of us. There are many kinds of evil. Archetypal identification, as I said before, necessarily causes evil. If I identify completely with whatever my ideas or beliefs are, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any ideas or beliefs, I'm saying when I totally identify with them, whether it's a religious conviction or an ideology, when the identification is archetypal and total, then even the most beautiful ones, such as complete equality for all, or peace upon all nations of the world, or when there may be no God besides mine, and this is not only an idea that I might adhere to, but a conviction that obliges me to implement it by any means, then I have no place any longer for the shadow in my soul. And then, when I split off my shadow, someone else has to carry it for me. And when the shadow is split off, when I identify with the grand truth, then the projected shadow becomes even more threatening. And it becomes my obligation, as if my divine command, my ideological duty, even in the name of of total peace, and in the name of brotherhood of humanity, I might have to kill those who don't believe in the brotherhood of humanity, in my peace, in my kind of peace, or I might feel obliged to destroy those who are reluctant to be part of my kind of love, paradoxically. Evil causes people to be trapped and tormented in the hell of insanity. When abroad, I am sometimes asked, how is it that you, as a people who have suffered, don't better understand the pledge of the other? Besides the fact that under the cruel circumstances under which we live, I find that sometimes there's quite a few sometimes are remarkably compassionate with the other, and there certainly are those who raise their voice against abuse and atrocity on either side. This is perhaps the most distressing of all questions. Evil, being exposed to evil, doesn't necessarily make anyone into a better human being. Why should it? It's almost an insult to expect someone who has been exposed to the horrors of evil to be a purified as if human being, a better human being than others, as if evil would have a purifying effect. Evil, as the result of archetypal identification with totality, causes and expresses the manifestations of extreme splitting. It causes the rape of eros, it strangles the breath of the soul, and it slaughters psyche. On the other hand, to quote from the Talmud, the one who dreams of Ishmael will find peace. That is, when there is a place for the other in my psyche, I am less likely to act out the evil that resides in all of us, and that perhaps pertains both to the subject and to the object, both to me as well as to the other. Thank you.